Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we slip through the ancient lacquered gates of the Forbidden City, where whispered secrets cling to silk tapestries and the very air hums with forgotten histories. Imagine, if you will, the soft rustle of imperial robes, the muted clang of a distant gong, and the faint scent of incense mingling with something less pleasant, something unseen but deeply felt. You're tiptoeing down a moonlit corridor, the intricate carvings on the pillars seeming to writhe in the shadows, and suddenly a cough echoes from behind a gilded screen. Not a polite little cough, but one heavy with a certain dread. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, at least not in spirit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and do let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a China vastly different from the one you know, a land on the cusp of the Qing Dynasty's zenith, yet already grappling with unseen threats that would gnaw at its foundations. The year is, let's say, the mid-17th century, a time when the world was both shrinking and expanding, when ideas, goods, and unfortunately diseases travelled further and faster than ever before. You feel the chill of the Forbidden City's massive walls, a symbol of imperial might and isolation, yet paradoxically, a nexus for global exchange. It's a place where even the smallest foreign trinket could cause a ripple, and a single, unseen germ could trigger a tidal wave. Our story tonight begins with an unwelcome guest, a microscopic invader that, according to mainstream historical fact, made its grand entrance into China sometime in the late 15th or early 16th century. This wasn't a gentle knock at the door, it was a silent, insidious infiltration. We're talking about syphilis, often referred to as the Great Pox in Europe, but in China it acquired various monikers, sometimes euphemistic, sometimes chillingly direct. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer confusion. Here you have a society with a sophisticated medical system, steeped in centuries of empirical observation and philosophical thought, suddenly confronted with a disease unlike anything they had routinely encountered. It wasn't the seasonal flu, nor the familiar pox. This was something that festered, warped, and returned, generation after generation. Historians still argue whether syphilis arrived via European traders and sailors navigating the bustling maritime routes, or perhaps through overland Silk Road connections from Central Asia. It's a bit like trying to pinpoint the exact moment your neighbour's really annoying barking dog moved in. You just know it arrived, and suddenly the peace was shattered. Regardless of its precise entry point, this microscopic stowaway found fertile ground in the densely populated urban centres, and crucially for our narrative, eventually made its way into the most guarded, most pristine environment in the empire, the imperial palace. You can almost hear the faint, disbelieving murmurs among the scholarly elite. This flower sore, as it was sometimes called, this Guangdong sore, where did it come from? Why does it behave so strangely? Remember, germ theory as you understand it was millennia away. They were grappling with imbalances of qi, with wind and dampness, with the intricate dance of yin and yang. A disease that manifested as seemingly innocuous sores, then vanished, only to return years later with devastating neurological and systemic effects, would have been utterly baffling. It was like a particularly nasty magic trick that nobody asked for. Now, consider the palace. A world unto itself, walled off from the common populace, yet paradoxically porous to the currents of the outside world, especially those carried by people. Think of the endless procession of tribute bearers, foreign envoys, merchants seeking imperial favour, and even, dare I say, the occasional rogue individual who managed to slip past the outer defences. Each of these interactions, however brief, carried a potential microscopic payload. It's like a very exclusive, very gilded petri dish, just waiting for the right kind of contamination. The quirky tidbit here is how traditional Chinese medicine, in its initial encounter with syphilis, sometimes misdiagnosed it as a severe form of leprosy or various other skin afflictions. Imagine being a highly respected imperial physician, having spent your life mastering the pulse, diagnosing subtle disharmonies, and then confronting a disease that defied all your established categories. It must have been profoundly unsettling, like trying to fix a complex piece of modern machinery with only a hammer and a manual for a donkey cart. You see the symptoms, You apply the usual remedies, and the patient just gets worse, or mysteriously better, only to decline later. It's enough to make you want to throw your elaborate herbal mortar and pestle across the room. The arrival of syphilis wasn't just a medical event. It was a societal earthquake in slow motion. For the common people, it meant suffering, disfigurement, and often death, further compounded by the prevailing moral judgments surrounding such illnesses. But within the walls of the Forbidden City, its implications were far more profound. Here, health was not merely a personal matter, it was an affair of state. The emperor's health, the vitality of his consorts, and the successful propagation of the imperial line were paramount. A disease that could silently undermine these pillars was a threat of the highest order, perhaps even more dangerous than a direct military invasion, because it struck from within, unseen, and often unspoken. You might imagine the whispered conversations behind silk screens, the hushed consultations in the imperial clinics, where even the most stoic physician would feel a tremor of fear. A concubine with inexplicable sores, an official with strange neurological symptoms, an emperor's sudden decline. These weren't just isolated cases, they were omens, signs of something deeply amiss. The palace, for all its splendour and power, was remarkably vulnerable to the unseen armies of microorganisms. It's a stark reminder that no amount of gold leaf or dragon motifs can truly ward off a determined bacterium. The groundwork, you now realise, is being laid for a profound medical drama playing out on the grandest of stages. Syphilis, though not our sole focus tonight, was the vanguard, the initial shock to the imperial system. Its arrival, its spread, and the initial inability to effectively combat it set a precedent. It opened the door, so to speak, for other, equally insidious venereal diseases to take hold and proliferate within the rarefied air of the Forbidden City. You are, in essence, witnessing the calm before the storm, a subtle shift in the medical landscape that will have far-reaching and devastating consequences for the Qing Dynasty's royal court. The stage is set, the unwitting actors are in place, and the microscopic antagonists are patiently biding their time. You continue your silent journey through the palace, the air now thick with unspoken anxieties. The initial shock of syphilis, like a sudden tremor, gave way to a deeper, more pervasive unease as the full implications of venereal diseases began to unfurl within the Forbidden City. This wasn't just about one disease, it was about a whole category of illnesses that silently, relentlessly, gnawed at the very fabric of imperial life. You see now that the palace, for all its outward splendour, was not immune to the vulnerabilities of the human body, particularly when those vulnerabilities were compounded by societal structures and profound ignorance of germ theory. Imagine the Forbidden City not just as a collection of magnificent halls and gardens, but as a vast, intricate ecosystem. Within this ecosystem, thousands of people lived in close proximity: emperors, empresses, concubines, princes, eunuchs, palace maids, guards, and countless servants. It was a bustling, self-contained world, a city within a city, and like any densely populated environment, it became a crucible for the spread of disease. You can almost hear the soft, almost imperceptible coughs, the occasional sigh of discomfort, the whispered complaints that, in retrospect, were the early warnings of a silent epidemic taking root. The particular challenge with venereal diseases like gonorrhea and, as we've already touched upon, syphilis, was their often insidious nature. Unlike smallpox, which declared its presence with undeniable pustules, or influenza, which brought sudden, incapacitating fever, these diseases could linger, presenting with mild, ambiguous symptoms or even lie dormant for extended periods. A concubine might experience a fleeting discomfort, dismiss it as a minor imbalance, and continue her daily routines, unknowingly carrying and transmitting the infection. An emperor might attribute a persistent ache or a subtle change in his constitution to the burdens of state, rather than to an internal microbial siege. This silent suffering, the unseen affliction, made diagnosis and containment nearly impossible. Mainstream historical fact confirms that gonorrhea, known in some Chinese medical texts as Lin Zheng, Lin syndrome, or Bajiao Huang, yellow discharge, from the lower orifice, was certainly present in China long before the Qing dynasty. However, its prevalence and impact within the secluded, hypersexualized environment of the imperial court are particularly noteworthy. Unlike syphilis, which could progress to horrifying neurological and systemic decay, Gonorrhea often manifested with localized, though incredibly uncomfortable symptoms: painful urination, discharge, and inflammation. For women especially, these symptoms could be less overt, often leading to chronic pelvic inflammatory disease, infertility, and excruciating pain that was easily misdiagnosed or simply endured in silence. You might wonder, how did such a private, often stigmatized illness spread so effectively within the most public and controlled environment in the empire? The answer lies in the complex web of relationships within the imperial court. The emperor, with his vast harem of wives and concubines, was at the very apex of this network. His sexual activity, far from being a private matter, was a crucial imperial function aimed at securing the lineage. Each interaction, each night spent with a new consort, was a potential vector. It's like a particularly unfortunate game of imperial musical chairs, where the music stops and everyone is exposed. But the emperor wasn't the only link. Concubines themselves, though their primary sexual partner was the emperor, lived in close quarters. They shared living spaces, bathing facilities, and often their personal maids. While direct sexual transmission between concubines was unlikely, the sharing of certain implements, think communal bathing areas, or even shared intimate objects, however unlikely that seems to modern sensibilities, could in theory create indirect pathways for bacterial spread, especially for incredibly robust bacteria like Neisseria gonorrhoeae that can survive briefly outside the body. Historians still argue whether such indirect transmission played a significant role, or if almost all cases stemmed from direct contact within the emperor's extensive sexual network. It's a bit of a medical whodunit, only without the satisfying conclusion of a Sherlock Holmes deduction. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the historical belief, common in many cultures, that venereal diseases were a form of divine punishment or a moral failing, rather than a purely biological one. This belief system wasn't unique to China, but in the highly ritualized and morally rigid environment of the Qing court, it undoubtedly compounded the silence and shame surrounding these illnesses. If a concubine contracted such an ailment, it might not just be seen as a medical problem, but as a sign of her moral impurity, a mark against her character, which could lead to severe social ostracization or even dismissal from the palace. So, not only were you dealing with searing pain, but also with the potential ruin of your entire existence. Just imagine trying to casually ask for some penicillin when the alternative is being branded as a moral degenerate. The silent suffering was particularly acute for the concubines. Their lives were dedicated to pleasing the emperor and, most importantly, bearing him sons. Any ailment that compromised their health, their beauty, or their fertility was a direct threat to their status and security. A woman suffering from the chronic pain and infertility caused by untreated gonorrhea would likely hide her symptoms for as long as possible, enduring immense discomfort rather than risking imperial displeasure or the loss of her privileged, albeit constrained, position. The doctors, when finally consulted, would often be sworn to the utmost secrecy, their primary directive being to treat the ailment without revealing its nature or its potentially embarrassing source. You begin to understand the immense pressure on these individuals. For an emperor, a persistent urinary infection or joint pain might simply be an annoyance, or a sign of aging. But for a concubine, these could spell the end of her prospects, even her life, within the cutthroat world of the harem. The irony is stark. The very system designed to ensure the continuation of the imperial line, with its emphasis on a single male ruler and a multitude of consorts, inadvertently became an amplifier for diseases that threatened that very continuity. The palace physicians, highly esteemed masters of traditional Chinese medicine, faced an unenviable task. Without microscopes, without germ theory, without antibiotics, they were fighting an invisible enemy with blunt instruments. Their vast pharmacopoeia of herbs, minerals, and animal products, while effective for a wide range of ailments, often proved woefully inadequate against bacteria like Neisseria gonorrhoeae or the spirochetes of syphilis. They would observe symptoms, palpate pulses, examine the tongue, and prescribe elaborate decoctions and poultices. Some remedies might have offered symptomatic relief, perhaps even temporary suppression of the infection, but a true cure remained elusive. It's like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a thimble. The sheer scale of the imperial household also contributed to the problem. With hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals living and working within the palace walls, maintaining strict hygiene was a monumental challenge, even in an era before modern sanitation. While Chinese civilization had advanced concepts of cleanliness, the close quarters and the hierarchical nature of interactions meant that an infection originating with one person could, through various pathways, spread discreetly through the population. You're now witnessing the quiet, persistent erosion of health and vitality within the Qing court. The grandeur you first observed is slowly being overshadowed by the shadows of illness. The problem wasn't merely the presence of these diseases, but their integration into the fabric of daily life, hidden behind politeness and shame, managed with remedies that were more palliative than curative, and quietly impacting the lives of those at the very pinnacle of power. The stage is set for a deeper exploration into the individual human cost of this silent epidemic, particularly for those whose beauty was their currency, and whose bodies were, in essence, instruments of state. The spread of venereal disease was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow-burning crisis, simmering beneath the surface of imperial serenity, ready to boil over in the lives of those least able to escape its reach. You now drift deeper into the opulent yet often tragic world of the imperial concubines. Their lives, though outwardly gilded, were fraught with unseen perils, particularly the secret ailments that often festered beneath their silken robes. Imagine the immense pressure these women faced to maintain their beauty, secure the emperor's favour, and above all to bear a healthy male heir. In this high-stakes environment, a persistent cough or a dull ache was not merely a personal discomfort, it was a potential catastrophe, a threat to their very existence within the palace hierarchy. The concubines, chosen for their beauty, lineage, and often their perceived fertility, entered the Forbidden City in their youth, full of hopes and ambitions. Yet, the life awaiting them was one of intense competition, strict etiquette, and profound isolation. They lived in segregated quarters, often with little to do but wait for the emperor's summons, or engage in the intricate social dances of the inner court. It was a life of luxury, certainly, but also one of profound vulnerability, especially when it came to their health. You can almost feel the stifling weight of expectation, the constant scrutiny, and the desperate need to hide any perceived flaw. Mainstream historical fact confirms that the imperial harem was a complex ecosystem of women ranging from the empress, the primary wife, to numerous consorts, concubines, and lower-ranking ladies. Their sheer numbers meant that the emperor had an extensive pool of potential partners, a system designed to ensure the continuation of the imperial line. However, this very system, while seemingly robust in terms of reproduction, inadvertently created a fertile ground for the spread of sexually transmitted infections. A single source, the emperor, interacting with a multitude of women, meant that an infection carried by him could rapidly disseminate through a significant portion of the female population within the palace. Conversely, an infection harboured by one concubine, if transmitted to the emperor, could then be passed to others. It's like a biological game of telephone, but with far more painful consequences. Consider the symptoms of gonorrhea for women. Often mild or even asymptomatic in its initial stages, it could progress to severe pelvic inflammatory disease, PID. You might envision a young concubine experiencing subtle vaginal discharge, perhaps a slight burning sensation during urination, or an unusual lower abdominal ache. These symptoms could easily be dismissed as minor ailments, attributed to fatigue, an imbalance of qi, or even the subtle discomforts of their menstrual cycle. There was no widespread understanding of specific bacterial infections, let alone the concept of asymptomatic carriers. So she might endure her discomfort in silence, perhaps relying on home remedies or the advice of her personal maid, rather than risking a formal consultation with an imperial physician, which could lead to unwanted attention or worse, exposure of her condition. The secrecy surrounding these ailments was paramount. A concubine's beauty and health were her most valuable assets. Any visible sign of illness, particularly one that might hint at a venereal infection, could lead to her being ostracized, losing favour, or even being banished to a more remote part of the palace or a secluded temple, effectively ending her imperial career. Imagine the chilling dread of knowing you harboured a secret illness, one that could not only cause immense physical pain, but also shatter your future and bring shame upon your family. It's a weight that would crush even the most resilient spirit. Historians still argue whether the infertility that plagued many imperial consorts and concubines was primarily due to these hidden venereal infections. While age, genetic factors, and other gynecological issues certainly played a role. Chronic PID, a common long-term complication of untreated gonorrhea, is a leading cause of tubal infertility. You can almost hear the heartbreaking whispers from women desperate to conceive, undergoing countless herbal treatments and rituals, all while an unseen bacterial enemy slowly closed off their fallopian tubes. It's a tragic irony that the very drive to secure the imperial succession was being silently undermined by the conditions within the palace itself. A particularly quirky tidbit relates to the length and formality of traditional Chinese medical examinations. Imagine the scene. A highly esteemed imperial physician, often an elderly man, would be summoned. He might be allowed to examine the patient only through a silk curtain, or only her wrist might be extended for a pulse reading, preserving her modesty and the strict decorum of the court. Detailed physical examinations, especially of intimate areas, were often taboo and rarely performed. This extreme modesty, while culturally appropriate, made the accurate diagnosis of gynecological infections exceedingly difficult. It's like trying to diagnose a broken leg by looking at someone's hat. The symptoms might be described vaguely, perhaps with euphemisms further obscuring the true nature of the illness. The psychological toll on these women must have been immense. Living in perpetual competition, under constant observation, and often separated from their families, they had little emotional outlet. Adding chronic pain, infertility, and the shame of a hidden illness to this already fragile existence would have been devastating. You can almost see the facade they had to maintain, serene, beautiful, always ready to serve, even as their bodies waged internal wars. The pressure to conceal their suffering would have been immense, leading to further delays in seeking treatment, and thus to the worsening of their conditions. The treatments offered by imperial physicians, as we touched upon earlier, were often symptomatic and relied heavily on the vast pharmacopoeia of traditional Chinese medicine. They might prescribe herbs to reduce inflammation, alleviate pain, or clear heat and dampness from the lower jiao, a concept in TCM related to the lower body. While some of these remedies could offer temporary relief or boost overall vitality, they lacked the specific antimicrobial properties required to eradicate bacterial infections like gonorrhea. You might imagine concoctions of potent herbs, meticulously prepared and consumed daily, offering fleeting moments of respite but never truly conquering the underlying infection. It was a valiant yet ultimately futile fight against an invisible foe. The concubines' vulnerability was compounded by their limited agency. They were, in many respects, imperial property, their lives dictated by the whims of the emperor and the strictures of the court. They couldn't simply walk out and seek alternative medical opinions or Western treatments, even if such were readily available, which they certainly were not for most of the Qing dynasty. Their world was circumscribed by palace walls and ancient traditions. Their bodies, in a sense, belonged to the imperial project, and any flaw or illness was not just theirs, but a potential blemish on the imperial image. You realise that the seemingly tranquil existence of the concubines concealed a profound drama of hidden pain and silent struggle. Their beauty, so meticulously cultivated, could mask a body ravaged by infection. Their apparent serenity could hide a mind consumed by worry and shame. This wasn't merely a matter of physical suffering. It was a deeply personal tragedy playing out within the very heart of the empire, a testament to how diseases, even microscopic ones, could profoundly shape individual destinies and, by extension, the course of history itself. The stage is now set to explore how these secret ailments influenced the elaborate beauty routines and daily lives of these women, further intertwining health, aesthetics, and hidden dangers. You observe the intricate daily routines within the concubines' quarters, where beauty rituals were not mere vanity, but a crucial aspect of imperial survival. Every hair ornament, every layer of meticulously applied powder, every fragrant bath served a purpose, to capture and maintain the emperor's fleeting attention. Yet, beneath this veneer of perfection, you begin to uncover the hidden dangers lurking within these very practices, dangers that could inadvertently contribute to the spread and exacerbation of their secret ailments. Imagine the concubines rising before dawn, a retinue of palace maids attending to their every need. Their beauty regimen was an elaborate, hours-long affair, a testament to the Qing court's emphasis on aesthetic perfection. You see them applying layers of white lead-based foundation, painting delicate eyebrows with soot and oils, and adorning their hair with intricate pins and flowers. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and musk, masking perhaps other, less pleasant odours. For these women, their appearance was their currency. their primary tool in the relentless competition for imperial favour. A flawless complexion, sparkling eyes, and a graceful demeanour were paramount. Mainstream historical fact confirms that many of the beauty products used in imperial China, while designed to enhance appearance, also contained ingredients that were, by modern standards, highly toxic or conducive to skin irritation. White lead was a common ingredient in face powder, providing that coveted pale complexion. While not directly linked to venereal disease transmission, prolonged use could compromise skin integrity, making it more susceptible to various infections. More pertinently, the sharing of certain beauty implements could become a vector. Consider the small, delicate brushes used for applying rouge, the combs for intricate hairstyles, or even the soft cloths used for drying after baths. In a communal environment, even if formal bathing was somewhat segregated, the casual sharing of such personal items, or their handling by multiple maids who then attended to different mistresses, could inadvertently facilitate the transfer of bacteria. The practice of shared bathing, even if limited to specific areas or times, presents another potential, though less direct pathway for transmission. While Neisseria gonorrhoeae is fragile outside the body and unlikely to survive long in bath water, the general lack of modern sanitation practices, combined with skin abrasions or open sores from other conditions, could create a vulnerable environment. Historians still argue whether such indirect non-sexual transmission routes for gonorrhea were significant within the palace, or if direct sexual contact with the emperor was overwhelmingly the primary mode. It's a nuanced debate, much like trying to figure out if your cold came from the doorknob or the handshake. A quirky or fringe tidbit from historical records suggests that some concubines, desperate to hide skin blemishes or eruptions that might indicate illness, resorted to increasingly extreme measures. Imagine a concubine with a discreet, persistent rash, perhaps a symptom of latent syphilis, trying to conceal it with thick layers of makeup, potent herbal poultices, or even traditional Chinese plaster bandages infused with various substances. This act of concealment, while understandable, often delayed proper diagnosis and treatment, allowing the underlying condition to worsen. It was a vicious cycle. The desire for beauty led to concealment, which led to progression of disease, which then led to more desperate attempts at concealment. You can almost see the frantic attempts to paint over the truth. The emphasis on cleanliness, while present in traditional Chinese culture, was often ritualistic rather than strictly germ theory based. Daily bathing, fragranced oils, and elaborate grooming were part of court etiquette. However, the understanding of microscopic pathogens was non-existent. So, while a concubine might emerge from her bath smelling of orchids, the bacteria causing her internal discomfort remained. Stubbornly resistant to perfumes and powders, it's like putting a lovely ribbon on a leaky pipe. It looks pretty, but the problem persists. The intimate access of personal maids to their mistresses also played a subtle, yet crucial role. These maids were privy to the most private aspects of the concubines' lives, including their physical complaints. They would assist with bathing, dressing, and applying topical remedies. While not direct sexual partners, their hands, if not meticulously cleaned between attending to different individuals, could potentially act as fomites, transferring bacteria from an infected concubine to a clean one, especially if there were any breaks in the skin. The lack of understanding about cross-contamination meant that the very hands providing intimate care could, unintentionally, be facilitating the spread of illness. Consider the role of perfumes and incense. While their primary purpose was to create a pleasant atmosphere and mask body odours, they could also be inadvertently used to cover up the telltale scents associated with certain infections, particularly vaginal discharge. Imagine a concubine adding extra layers of fragrant oils to her intimate clothing, or burning copious amounts of incense in her chambers, not just for aesthetic appeal, but as a discreet attempt to hide a symptom she dared not voice. This act of masking, while providing temporary psychological comfort, only served to delay proper medical attention. The competition among concubines was brutal. A woman's standing depended almost entirely on the emperor's favour, and perceived physical perfection was key to gaining and retaining that favour. This created an intense environment where any physical imperfection or sign of illness became a profound liability. The concubines lived under constant scrutiny, not just from the emperor but from the empress, other high-ranking consorts, and even the eunuchs who managed the palace's inner workings. The pressure to present a flawless image was immense. often leading to a stoic endurance of pain and discomfort rather than a public admission of weakness. You also consider the psychological impact of living with a chronic hidden illness while maintaining such a demanding facade of beauty. The constant worry, the fear of exposure, the physical discomfort, it would be a profound burden. This stress itself could further weaken the immune system, making them more susceptible to other infections. It's a cruel irony. The very beauty that was supposed to bring them security became a cage, trapping them in a cycle of concealment and suffering. The imperial physicians, when called upon to treat such delicate matters, faced a dilemma. Their primary duty was to maintain the health of the imperial family, but they also had to navigate the treacherous currents of court politics and personal modesty. Diagnosing a venereal disease in a concubine would require incredible tact and discretion. The diagnosis itself carried immense shame, not just for the concubine, but potentially for the emperor himself if he was the source. This delicate dance meant that descriptions in medical records might be vague, euphemistic, or entirely absent, further obscuring the true prevalence of these diseases. The elaborate beauty rituals, therefore, become a poignant symbol of this hidden tragedy. The lustrous hair, the smooth skin, the fragrant robes, all were carefully constructed illusions, often masking pain, infertility, and chronic infection. The pursuit of beauty in this context inadvertently became a participant in the spread and concealment of disease, transforming objects of adornment into potential vectors, and acts of self-care into acts of dangerous denial. It's a sobering thought, that the very things meant to enhance and preserve life could, in an age of ignorance, contribute to its quiet decay. The stage is now set to explore how the imperial physicians, with their traditional wisdom, grappled with these baffling and sensitive health crises. You now stand in the hallowed halls of the Imperial Medical Bureau, observing the court physicians as they grappled with what seemed like insurmountable odds. Their task was immense, to safeguard the health of the emperor, his vast harem, and the entire imperial household. Yet, they faced an invisible enemy, armed only with centuries of traditional knowledge and what, to you, seems like desperate measures in the face of microscopic invaders they couldn't even conceive of. Imagine the physicians, revered for their wisdom and skill, poring over ancient texts, their brows furrowed with concern. They understood the body as a delicate balance of yin and yang, qi, and the 5 elements. They were masters of pulse diagnosis, acupuncture, and a vast pharmacopoeia of herbs, minerals, and animal products. For centuries, this system had served the empire well, treating everything from seasonal fevers to broken bones. But venereal diseases, with their elusive symptoms, long incubation periods, and systemic effects, presented an entirely new and baffling challenge. It was like asking a master chef to build a rocket. They have skills, but perhaps not the right ones for this particular problem. Mainstream historical fact confirms that imperial physicians were highly trained and held in great esteem. They meticulously documented symptoms, observed changes in pulse and tongue, and prescribed complex herbal decoctions tailored to each patient's specific constitution and diagnosed imbalance. For gonorrhea, their approach would typically focus on clearing heat and dampness from the lower jiao, addressing inflammation, and alleviating painful urination. They would use herbs known for their diuretic and anti-inflammatory properties, such as plantago seed, chitianzi, or acacia stem, mutong. For the later stages of syphilis, which might manifest as skin lesions or neurological symptoms, they would use potent detoxifying and blood-invigorating herbs, sometimes incorporating minerals like mercury, which, while toxic, was believed to have strong pox-removing properties. The use of mercury is a particularly grim example of a desperate measure. While it gained popularity in both East and West as a syphilis treatment, its effectiveness was questionable, and its toxicity was undeniable. You can almost see the physician carefully administering a mercury-laced pill or ointment, hoping for a miracle while unknowingly subjecting the patient to neurological damage, tremors, and tooth loss. Historians still argue whether the long-term use of mercury exacerbated the suffering of imperial patients, or if its occasional symptomatic relief justified its widespread, albeit dangerous, application. It's a tragic testament to the limits of pre-scientific medicine, where the cure could sometimes be as bad as, if not worse than, the disease. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the medical texts of the era reveals the elaborate, almost poetic language used to describe symptoms and remedies. Instead of vaginal discharge, you might read about white turbidity like rice water, or yellow flow like pus. Treatments were not just about chemical reactions. They were about restoring harmony, balancing energies, and expelling evil influences. This rich, metaphorical language, while beautiful, could sometimes obscure the precise nature of the ailment, making clear diagnosis and consistent treatment protocols challenging across different practitioners. It's like trying to get a straight answer from a particularly verbose poet, when what you really need is a simple yes or no. The physicians also operated under immense political pressure. The health of the imperial family was a matter of state security. A concubine's illness, especially one that could be stigmatizing, had to be treated with absolute discretion. The doctors were sworn to secrecy, often having to report only vague assessments to higher authorities, protecting the emperor's reputation and the concubine's dignity. Imagine the tightrope walk. You need to accurately diagnose and treat, but you cannot reveal the true nature of the illness nor its source. It required not just medical acumen, but extraordinary diplomatic skill. Consider the emperor's own health. If he contracted a venereal disease, the physicians faced the ultimate test. They couldn't simply prescribe a course of treatment and send him home to rest. Every imperial sneeze was a state affair, every malaise scrutinized. And if the emperor's illness stemmed from his own sexual activity, the physicians were in an incredibly delicate position. They had to administer treatment without implying blame or suggesting a curtailment of his imperial prerogatives. It's a job where job security likely depended on the emperor's good health and ignorance of certain realities. The inherent limitations of their diagnostic tools further complicated their efforts. Without microscopy, they couldn't see the bacteria causing gonorrhea or the spirochetes of syphilis. They relied entirely on macroscopic observation of symptoms, pulse readings, and patient descriptions. Imagine trying to identify a specific type of invading army by only hearing distant battle sounds and seeing a few flags fluttering on the horizon. They knew something was attacking, but they couldn't identify the enemy or understand its strategy. Despite these limitations, the imperial physicians were not entirely without successes. For many non-venereal ailments, their herbal remedies and therapeutic techniques were highly effective. Their detailed knowledge of anatomy and physiology, albeit based on different principles, allowed them to perform surgeries, set bones, and manage various chronic conditions. But against systemic bacterial infections, particularly those that could evade detection for long periods, their methods often fell short of a true cure, resulting in temporary relief or the masking of symptoms. This constant battle against the unknown, this reliance on traditional wisdom against a constantly evolving biological threat, must have been profoundly frustrating. You can almost feel the weight of their responsibility. The sleepless nights spent contemplating baffling cases, the quiet despair when their most potent remedies failed to stem the tide of illness in a favoured concubine, or even, God forbid, the emperor himself. The imperial court, for all its power, was deeply vulnerable to the limitations of its medical science. Historians still debate the true impact of these limitations on the longevity and health of various Qing emperors and their consorts. Were dynastic declines subtly influenced by chronic, debilitating, and undiagnosed or poorly treated illnesses within the imperial family? It's a question that modern medical forensics, if applied to historical remains, might someday begin to answer, but for now it remains a vast area of scholarly conjecture. The silent suffering behind gilded walls leaves few definitive biological clues. The physicians' desperate measures were born out of a profound commitment to their duty and the profound limitations of their era. They were, in essence, doing the best they could with the tools and knowledge available to them. Their efforts, though often insufficient by modern standards, highlight the timeless human struggle against disease and the continuous evolution of medical understanding. You realize that even in the most absolute monarchy, ultimate power could not command the microbes to simply disappear. The vulnerability of the human body, even a royal one, remained an unyielding constant. This inadequacy of their medical prowess, combined with the extreme secrecy, created a fertile ground for the silent suffering that permeated the very atmosphere of the Forbidden City. You feel the weight of history pressing in as you move through the labyrinthine passages of the Forbidden City. The very air seems to carry secrets, and the whispering walls of the imperial palace reveal how its unique combination of isolation and rigid hierarchy exacerbated the spread and concealment of illness. This wasn't just a place of power and ceremony. It was a gilded cage where disease could flourish unseen, its progress aided by the very structures designed to maintain order and purity. Imagine the palace as a series of concentric circles. At the centre, the emperor, surrounded by his immediate family, the empress, high-ranking consorts, and their children. Further out, the concubines, then the legions of eunuchs, palace maids, guards, and servants. This strict spatial and social hierarchy, while designed to enforce order and security, also created a breeding ground for problems. Once a disease entered one of these circles, especially the inner ones, it could circulate discreetly within that confined population, shielded from the outside world and from comprehensive external scrutiny. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes the profound isolation of the imperial court. Few people from outside were permitted regular access to the inner sanctums. This meant that once an infectious agent, like Neisseria gonorrhoeae or the spirochete of syphilis, gained entry, it was largely contained within this finite, often intermarrying population. While this might sound like a good thing for preventing widespread epidemics outside the palace, it meant that within the palace, the infection could become endemic, passed back and forth within the sexually active population of the emperor and his concubines, or, as we'll explore, potentially through other less direct but still viable vectors. It's like sealing a small leaky boat and hoping the water will just disappear. The eunuchs, for instance, occupied a unique and ambiguous position. They served as intermediaries between the inner and outer courts, managing everything from finances to palace protocol, and intimately attending to the needs of the imperial family, including the concubines. While sexually castrated, they were still capable of carrying and transmitting certain bacteria on their hands or clothing, especially if hygiene was not perfectly maintained. Historians still argue about the extent to which eunuchs, inadvertently, acted as vectors for non-sexual transmission within the palace, for example, by handling contaminated intimate items or through general close contact. It's a fascinating and rather uncomfortable thought. The very individuals tasked with guarding imperial purity might have, unwittingly, been spreading impurity. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the concept of palace air, or imperial miasma. While largely unscientific, the persistent illnesses within the court might have given rise to popular, superstitious explanations about the air within the Forbidden City being somehow unique or cursed, leading to illness. Imagine the whispered folk tales among the palace staff about certain chambers being unlucky or sickly, without anyone truly understanding the biological cause. This blend of fear and ignorance only compounded the problem, diverting attention from the real, microscopic culprits. The hierarchical structure also meant that information, especially concerning sensitive matters like illness, flowed upward very slowly and often in a highly censored form. A junior concubine suffering from discomfort might first confide in her personal maid. The maid might then discreetly seek informal advice from a lower-ranking eunuch or a less prestigious physician. By the time the illness reached the attention of the senior imperial physicians, or, God forbid, the emperor, it might have progressed significantly, or been masked by vague euphemisms. This chain of command, so effective for administration, was a bottleneck for urgent medical intervention. It's like playing a game of telephone with a medical emergency, where the message gets garbled at every step. The intense focus on imperial lineage further complicated matters. Any illness that threatened fertility or the ability to produce a healthy heir was treated with the utmost secrecy. If a concubine was found to be infertile, especially due to a venereal infection, it was a profound failure, not just for her but for the imperial project. The court's primary goal was to ensure a continuous line of strong, healthy emperors. The silent presence of diseases that undermined fertility and weakened the very individuals meant to carry on this legacy was a fundamental, yet often unacknowledged threat. You might envision the daily life of a concubine, confined to her lavish but restrictive quarters. Her social circle was largely limited to other concubines, eunuchs, and palace maids. This created a closed loop. An infection introduced by the emperor could circulate within this small, isolated community, perhaps causing subtle symptoms that were endured in silence or treated with ineffective remedies. The lack of outside contact meant there was little opportunity for fresh perspectives on their medical conditions or access to alternative treatments, however limited those might have been in that era. The culture of discretion and face-saving was paramount. Openly discussing venereal diseases was unthinkable, especially within the refined atmosphere of the palace. Symptoms were described euphemistically, if at all. Treatments were often administered in private with strict instructions for secrecy. This pervasive need to save face, to maintain a facade of health, purity and imperial perfection, became a formidable barrier to effective public health measures within the palace. It's a bit like having a raging fire, but everyone is too polite to shout, "Fire!" Historians still debate the specific impact of the eunuch system on palace health. While their castration meant they were not directly involved in sexual transmission, their constant close contact with both the emperor and the concubines, their handling of intimate objects, and their management of daily routines certainly positioned them as potential indirect carriers. The nature of their duties, assisting with bathing, dressing, and even attending to the emperor's or concubine's personal needs, placed them in a unique position to either facilitate or inhibit the spread of infection, depending on their hygiene practices, about which historical records are largely silent. The architecture of the Forbidden City itself, with its sprawling complexes of courtyards and separate living quarters, while seemingly promoting isolation, also contributed to the challenge. While concubines had their own residences, they were still part of a collective and shared common services, resources, and often servants. The complex logistics of managing such a vast household, combined with limited understanding of germ theory, meant that maintaining true hygienic separation was a Herculean task, if not an impossible one. You begin to appreciate the layers of vulnerability within this seemingly impregnable fortress. The whispering walls held not only the echoes of imperial power, but also the quiet laments of those suffering from unseen afflictions. The very systems designed to protect the imperial family, its isolation, its hierarchy, its emphasis on discretion, paradoxically became conduits and concealers of disease. The silent spread of venereal infections within the Forbidden City was a testament to the fact that even the most powerful empire could be brought low by the smallest, unacknowledged threats. This silent suffering kept hidden from the public eye would have profound consequences, not just for the individual concubines, but for the very man at the apex of this vulnerable pyramid, the emperor himself. You shift your focus now to the very pinnacle of the imperial hierarchy, the solitary figure who held the fate of an empire in his hands, yet whose own body was besieged by unseen forces. You confront the emperor's private torment, the insidious ways in which venereal diseases affected the Qing rulers themselves, subtly yet profoundly impacting their ability to govern, their personal well-being, and critically, the continuation of their sacred lineage. Imagine the emperor, burdened by the immense responsibilities of state sitting on his dragon throne. He is the son of heaven, a figure of divine authority and earthly power. Yet beneath the imperial robes he is a man, susceptible to the same frailties as his subjects, and in this case, even more exposed due to the unique structure of his domestic life. The very system designed to ensure a multitude of heirs, the vast harem, also served as a potential vector for illnesses that could weaken him and imperil the dynasty. Mainstream historical fact indicates that while direct evidence of specific emperors suffering from gonorrhea or syphilis is often scarce due to the intense secrecy surrounding imperial health, the patterns of their illnesses, unexplained periods of weakness, and issues with fertility or the health of their offspring are highly suggestive. Emperors, with their numerous concubines, were at the highest risk of contracting and spreading sexually transmitted infections. A single emperor could interact with dozens, if not hundreds, of women throughout his reign, creating a perfect environment for the cyclical transmission of these diseases. It's like a particularly unfortunate game of imperial Russian roulette, but with more players and much higher stakes. Consider the symptoms of gonorrhea or syphilis as they might manifest in an emperor. Early gonorrhea could cause painful urination, discharge, or joint pain, symptoms easily dismissed as fatigue from state affairs, a minor kidney ailment, or even gout. Later, untreated gonorrhea could lead to systemic complications, including painful arthritis, gonococcal arthritis, that could severely limit mobility and cause chronic discomfort. Syphilis, in its tertiary stages, could lead to neurological decline, mental instability, severe skin lesions, or cardiovascular problems. Imagine an emperor grappling with agonizing joint pain during long court audiences, or suffering from periods of confusion and irritability, all while attempting to project an image of unshakable wisdom and authority. Historians still argue whether certain imperial eccentricities, unexplained periods of withdrawal, or even alleged instances of mental instability among Qing emperors might be in part attributable to the long-term effects of untreated venereal diseases, particularly neurosyphilis. The lack of precise medical records makes definitive diagnosis impossible, but the correlations are certainly intriguing. It's like trying to put together a puzzle with half the pieces missing and no picture on the box. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the concept of imperial yang deficiency, a term sometimes used by physicians to describe general weakness, fatigue, or perceived sexual decline in emperors. While not directly related to a specific venereal disease, it could have been a convenient umbrella term to explain symptoms that were, in fact, caused by chronic infections like gonorrhea or the early stages of syphilis. This allowed physicians to offer treatments without explicitly diagnosing a stigmatizing condition, thereby saving face for all parties involved. It's a bit like calling a massive crack in the wall aesthetic erosion, to avoid admitting the house is falling apart. The impact on the emperor's ability to rule cannot be overstated. An emperor suffering from chronic pain, debilitating fatigue, or the mental fog associated with neurosyphilis would be less effective in making crucial decisions, presiding over court, or engaging in the rigorous intellectual and ritualistic duties of his office. His judgments might be impaired, his patience frayed, and his presence diminished. While eunuchs and grand councillors could manage many daily affairs, the ultimate authority rested with the Son of Heaven. A weakened emperor meant a weakened state. Furthermore, the emperor's sexual vitality was deeply intertwined with his imperial legitimacy and the health of the dynasty. A perceived decline in his virility, or an inability to produce healthy heirs, could be a source of immense personal anxiety and public concern. The physicians would be under immense pressure to restore his vigour, often prescribing potent tonics and aphrodisiacs that, while perhaps boosting morale temporarily, did nothing to address the underlying bacterial infection. This created a cycle of ineffective treatments and prolonged suffering. You might imagine the whispered consultations between the emperor and his most trusted imperial physicians, conducted in the utmost secrecy, perhaps late at night in a secluded chamber. The physician, bowing low, would carefully examine the imperial pulse, observe the imperial tongue, and listen to the vague complaints, all while trying to decipher the true nature of the imperial malady, without asking too many probing, indelicate questions. The emperor too would be unlikely to provide explicit details, fearing the shame associated with such illnesses. This mutual reticence made accurate diagnosis incredibly challenging. The psychological toll on the emperor would also have been immense. The loneliness of power, combined with chronic physical discomfort and the fear of a hidden, shameful illness, would be a crushing burden. He could confide in no one truly. The public facade of invincibility had to be maintained at all costs. This internal struggle, this private torment, adds a layer of poignant tragedy to the lives of these powerful rulers. The consequences for the imperial lineage were perhaps the most devastating. Untreated gonorrhea in women could lead to infertility, and syphilis could result in miscarriages, stillbirths, or the birth of congenitally infected children, often frail or suffering from severe developmental issues. If the emperor was a carrier, he could be unknowingly passing these afflictions onto his consorts and, tragically, onto his offspring. The constant demand for healthy male heirs meant that any impediment to successful procreation was a profound crisis. The silent impact of these diseases could subtly undermine the very stability of the dynasty. A series of sickly emperors, or a succession crisis due to a lack of healthy male heirs, could weaken the central authority, encourage factionalism, and ultimately contribute to dynastic decline. While it's rarely the sole cause, chronic illness at the very top of the social pyramid acts like a slow poison, eroding strength and vitality from within. You now appreciate that the emperor's private torment was not merely a personal misfortune. It was a silent crisis that rippled outwards, affecting the entire court and potentially the vast empire. The inability of even the Son of Heaven to escape the clutches of microscopic invaders and the profound secrecy surrounding his ailments underscores the era's medical limitations and the pervasive stigma attached to venereal disease. This personal suffering, now laid bare, leads inevitably to a deeper examination of how these insidious illnesses jeopardized the very lineage and legacy of the Qing dynasty. you now perceive the chilling implications of the emperor's private torment extending far beyond his personal suffering, rippling outward to threaten the very heart of the empire. The presence of venereal diseases within the imperial family placed the lineage and legacy jeopardized, undermining the sacred duty of the Qing dynasty to provide strong, healthy heirs and ensure its continuous mandate of heaven-blessed rule. Imagine the ancestral temples where the tablets of previous emperors stood in solemn rows, embodying the continuity of power. The very essence of dynastic legitimacy in China rested upon an unbroken line of succession, particularly through male heirs. A healthy, numerous progeny was not just a personal desire for the emperor, it was a state imperative, a tangible sign of heaven's favour. Yet, within the gilded walls, unseen bacterial enemies were working relentlessly to sabotage this most vital imperial project. Mainstream historical fact emphasises the profound importance of male heirs in imperial China. A large number of sons was seen as a blessing, ensuring not only the continuation of the dynastic line, but also providing a larger pool from which to select capable future rulers. However, sexually transmitted infections like gonorrhea and syphilis could severely impede this. Gonorrhea in women often leads to pelvic inflammatory disease, PID, a primary cause of tubal infertility. Untreated, it could make conception impossible or lead to ectopic pregnancies, which were almost invariably fatal for the mother in that era. Syphilis, on the other hand, could cause repeated miscarriages, stillbirths, or the birth of congenitally infected infants who often suffered from severe health problems, deformities, or died in early childhood. Consider the heartbreaking reality for a concubine. Desperate to bear a son, undergoing various rituals and consuming countless herbal remedies, all while unknowingly battling an infection that had rendered her infertile. Or imagine the imperial family's joy at the birth of a child, only for that joy to turn to despair as the infant developed congenital syphilis, marked by skin lesions, bone deformities, or eventual neurological damage. These were not just personal tragedies, they were profound crises for the dynasty. The quiet frequency of such occurrences, though rarely explicitly documented as venereal disease, must have been a constant gnawing anxiety within the court. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which venereal diseases contributed to the succession crises or the perceived weakening of the imperial lineage in the late Qing dynasty. While political instability, economic decline, and external pressures were certainly major factors in the dynasty's eventual fall, a weakened or compromised imperial family, beset by chronic illness and difficulties in producing healthy heirs, would have undeniably exacerbated these issues. It's like a grand old tree. External storms certainly threaten it, but if its roots are rotting from within, it's far more vulnerable. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the intense focus on auspicious birth dates and astrological signs for imperial children. While seemingly unrelated to venereal disease, this cultural practice, in a strange way, might have served as a coping mechanism or a way to attribute meaning to the unpredictable outcomes of birth. If a child was born sickly or died prematurely, blame could be subtly shifted to unfavourable stars or ill omens, rather than confronting the uncomfortable truth of disease transmission within the sacred imperial line. It was a way of externalizing an internal medical problem into the realm of fate. The selection of emperors often involved intricate court politics. If there was a scarcity of healthy male heirs, or if existing princes were perceived as weak or sickly, the field of succession narrowed dramatically. This could lead to intense factionalism, power struggles among competing factions of eunuchs, ministers, and even different branches of the imperial clan, each backing their preferred candidate. A robust, healthy imperial progeny, by contrast, provided stability and a clearer path for succession. The silent toll of venereal diseases on fertility and infant mortality thus had direct, destabilizing political ramifications. You might envision the grand imperial ceremonies, where princes were presented to the court, their health and vitality scrutinized. A frail or sickly prince, even if he survived to adulthood, might be seen as less capable of holding the mandate of heaven, casting a shadow over his legitimacy. This perception, whether accurate or not, could lead to challenges to his authority and further internal strife. The physical manifestation of disease, even if its cause was hidden, could subtly erode the aura of imperial perfection. The legacy of the Qing dynasty was meant to be one of power, prosperity, and enduring rule. Yet the persistent shadow of venereal diseases threatened to tarnish this legacy by undermining its most fundamental aspect, the continuation of the imperial bloodline. The emperors, who were supposed to be the embodiment of strength and fertility, were themselves vulnerable, and through them, their consorts and children were similarly exposed. This created a profound irony, where the very practices intended to secure the future of the dynasty inadvertently planted the seeds of its internal decay. The knowledge, or at least suspicion, of these hidden illnesses would also have impacted the imperial family's psychological landscape. The empress, concubines, and even the emperor himself would live with a constant undercurrent of anxiety regarding fertility, successful births, and the health of their children. Every miscarriage would be a devastating blow, every sickly child a source of profound worry. This emotional toll, while unquantifiable, certainly added to the immense pressures of imperial life. The court physicians, caught between the medical reality and the political necessity of maintaining appearances, often recorded deaths or illnesses with vague descriptions, attributing them to yin deficiency, qi imbalance, or evil winds. This deliberate ambiguity, while protecting imperial face, means that modern historians struggle to precisely identify the extent of venereal disease impact. The true scale of the problem is likely understated in official records, leaving a scholarly debate that continues to this day about the specific health challenges faced by the later Qing emperors and their families. It's like trying to count ghosts. You know they're there, but you can't quite grasp them. The ultimate tragedy is the quiet undermining of a powerful lineage. The Qing emperors strove to emulate their mighty predecessors, to expand their empire, and to ensure generations of prosperity. Yet, a microscopic enemy, misunderstood and concealed, slowly eroded the vitality of the very core of that imperial structure. The jeopardy to the lineage and legacy was not a sudden cataclysm, but a creeping decay, a silent testament to the devastating power of neglected disease and the limitations of an era's medical knowledge. This recognition of the medical inadequacies within the palace now compels us to examine the very remedies employed by the court physicians and how effective, or ineffective, their traditional approaches proved to be against these persistent modern-sounding plagues. You now find yourself observing the earnest, often futile efforts of the Qing imperial physicians as they sought to combat venereal diseases with their formidable arsenal of herbal cures and deep-seated ancient beliefs. They were masters of a medical system honed over millennia, a system that had brought relief and healing to countless generations. Yet, against the specific biological mechanisms of gonorrhea and syphilis, their highly sophisticated approach often met with limited success. Imagine a grand hall within the Imperial Medical Bureau, filled with the pungent aromas of dried herbs, minerals, and various animal products. Scrolls of medical texts, some dating back centuries, line the walls, detailing an encyclopedic knowledge of botany, pharmacology, and human physiology. Physicians meticulously weighed ingredients, pounded them into powders, and brewed complex decoctions. Their dedication was absolute, their understanding of the human body through their own framework profound. But what they lacked was the fundamental insight of germ theory and the targeted weapons of antibiotics. Mainstream historical fact confirms that traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, possessed a rich pharmacopoeia for treating a wide array of symptoms. For gonorrhea, often diagnosed as linzeng, painful urination syndrome, or bajiaohuang, yellow discharge, physicians focused on clearing heat and dampness, promoting urination, and reducing inflammation. Common herbal ingredients included Dianthus superbus, kumai, Akebia quinata, mutong, Plantago asiatica, Cheqianzi, and Philodendron amorense, huangbai, all known for their diuretic and anti-inflammatory properties. These remedies could certainly alleviate symptoms, reduce pain, and perhaps even suppress the bacterial load to some extent. But they rarely achieved a complete eradication of the infection. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a watering can. You might dampen a few leaves, but the inferno rages on. For syphilis, known by various names such as Yangmei Chuang, plum blossom sore, or Guangchuang, Guangdong sore, the treatments were often more aggressive, reflecting the disease's more severe and systemic manifestations. Physicians often used herbs believed to detoxify the body and resolve toxins or poison, such as Smilax glabra, Tufuling, and Lonicera japonica, Jinyinhua. Crucially, mercury in various forms, calomel cinnabar, was also widely employed. While mercury had a long history of use in both Eastern and Western medicine for syphilis, its efficacy was debatable, and its toxicity was undeniable. Patients might experience temporary remission of symptoms, but often at the cost of severe side effects like neurological damage, kidney failure, and gum disease. Historians still argue whether the extensive use of mercury in Qing Dynasty, treatments for syphilis caused more harm than good to the patients, or if its perceived benefits, however fleeting, justified its inherent dangers. It's a complex ethical question, considering the absence of any safer, more effective alternatives at the time. You can almost hear the desperate pleas of a patient, willing to try anything, no matter how risky, to escape the ravages of the disease. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the concept of treating the root and the branch. In TCM, a physician would aim not just to alleviate the immediate symptoms, the branch, but also to address the underlying imbalance or disharmony, the root. While a sophisticated concept for general health, for specific bacterial infections, this could sometimes lead to lengthy treatments focused on strengthening the patient's constitution or balancing their qigong, without directly targeting the pathogen with a truly antimicrobial agent. So, while a patient might feel generally stronger, the bacteria would remain quietly multiplying, ready to cause a flare-up. The physician's ancient beliefs shaped their entire approach. They understood illness not as an invasion by external microorganisms, but as a disruption of internal harmony, often influenced by external environmental factors like wind, cold, dampness, or heat. This meant their diagnostic gaze was turned inward, focusing on the patient's unique constitution and presenting imbalances rather than outward towards a specific identifiable pathogen. This philosophical framework, while holistic and deeply insightful in many contexts, proved a significant barrier to effectively eradicating diseases caused by specific bacteria. Consider the meticulous pulse diagnosis. The physician would spend a long time feeling the patient's radial pulse, discerning its various qualities: rapid, slow, floating, deep, slippery, wiry, each indicating a specific imbalance. While incredibly refined, this diagnostic method could not differentiate between, say, a fever caused by gonorrhea and one caused by influenza. The remedies prescribed would target the fever or inflammation generally, rather than the specific bacterial culprit. It's like trying to fix a complex plumbing leak by adjusting the temperature of the house. The lack of understanding regarding asymptomatic carriers was another major hurdle. A person could carry gonorrhea or syphilis for extended periods without overt symptoms, unknowingly transmitting the disease. The imperial physicians, relying on visible signs and reported discomfort, would have no way of identifying these silent carriers. This meant that even if a concubine was cured of her active symptoms, she might still be carrying the bacteria, ready to reinfect the emperor, or to suffer a relapse herself later. This perpetual cycle of infection and reinfection was a profound challenge. The emperor himself, and the concubines, would also hold strong beliefs about their bodies and illnesses. They might resist certain treatments, prefer specific remedies based on personal anecdote, or simply neglect instructions due to the inconvenience or the desire for secrecy. This human element, combined with the inherent limitations of the medicine, meant that even the best-intentioned treatment might not be fully effective. You can almost sense the physician's frustration, the weight of their responsibility. They would diligently apply their vast knowledge, observe their patients closely, and adjust their herbal formulas. Sometimes there would be improvement, a temporary respite. Other times, the illness would persist, or recur, baffling their wisdom and challenging their faith in their own system. The silent despair of a physician who knew he was doing his utmost, but still saw his imperial patient decline, must have been immense. The legacy of these herbal cures and ancient beliefs is complex. While they failed to definitively eradicate venereal diseases in the way modern antibiotics do, they often provided symptomatic relief, supported the body's natural healing processes, and perhaps even bolstered the patient's morale. They represent the pinnacle of pre-scientific medical knowledge, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of suffering. However, their limitations against the specific microbial threats of gonorrhea and syphilis underscore the critical role that scientific advancements, particularly germ theory, would eventually play in revolutionizing medicine. Historians still debate the overall effectiveness of TCM against sexually transmitted diseases in the Qing Dynasty. While direct comparisons to modern medicine are anachronistic, It is clear that these illnesses remained a significant and persistent problem within the court, suggesting that the traditional remedies, while providing some comfort, were ultimately insufficient for widespread eradication or lasting cure. This continuous struggle against persistent illness, despite the best efforts of revered physicians, reveals the deep-seated social stigma and pervasive secrecy that prevented both open discussion and effective intervention within the imperial court. You now feel the pervasive chill of social stigma and the suffocating blanket of royal secrecy settling over the Forbidden City. These were not merely abstract concepts. They were powerful, unseen forces that shaped behaviour, dictated silence, and ultimately ensured the continued spread of venereal diseases within the imperial court. In a society where face and reputation were paramount, and purity was inextricably linked to imperial legitimacy, the very idea of such an illness became a profound source of shame, leading to elaborate and often counterproductive efforts to maintain absolute concealment. Imagine the atmosphere in the palace if a concubine developed symptoms suggestive of a venereal disease. Her immediate reaction would be not to seek immediate comprehensive medical care, but to hide the rash, to mask the discharge, to feign robustness. Why? Because the social repercussions of such a diagnosis were potentially catastrophic. A concubine found to be unclean, or afflicted with a disease often associated with moral failing, however unfairly risked losing imperial favour, being ostracised by her peers, or even being banished from the palace to a life of quiet despair in a secluded temple. Her family too would share in this shame, their reputation tarnished by her perceived impurity. Mainstream historical fact confirms that diseases of a sexual nature carried immense social stigma across many cultures, and Qing China was no exception. While traditional Chinese medicine generally approached illness from a holistic perspective of imbalance, the societal perception of venereal diseases often intertwined with notions of moral impurity or illicit behaviour, even if the individual was simply a victim of transmission within a sanctioned marital or imperial context. This moral judgment meant that open discussion was taboo, and secrecy became a survival mechanism. It's like having a giant blinking neon sign above your head that says unclean, except you're desperate for no one to see it. The emperor himself, as the Son of Heaven, was expected to embody perfection and purity. Any illness, particularly one perceived to be shameful, would be a profound blow to his image, and by extension to the prestige of the dynasty. Therefore, if the emperor or a high-ranking consort contracted such a disease, the efforts to maintain royal secrecy would be extraordinary. Physicians would be sworn to the strictest oath of silence, their records deliberately vague or euphemistic. Courtiers would whisper, but never openly speak, of any imperial malaise that seemed untoward. This pervasive silence, while protecting face, created an information vacuum that prevented honest assessment and effective intervention. Historians still argue whether the lack of explicit records regarding venereal diseases in imperial archives is due to their genuine rarity, or more likely, a deliberate and pervasive policy of concealment driven by social stigma and the need for royal secrecy. The consensus leans heavily towards the latter, suggesting that the problem was far more widespread than official histories let on. It's a bit like trying to solve a mystery when all the witnesses are under a lifelong gag order. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the use of elaborate symbolic language in imperial medical records to describe symptoms that might be too sensitive or shameful to name directly. For example, rather than genital sores, a physician might write about a plum blossom eruption in the lower courtyard, or unusual heat and dampness affecting the Jade Gate. While maintaining decorum, this euphemistic language could also hinder precise diagnosis, and make it difficult for later physicians to understand the true nature of the illness or to track its prevalence across the court. It was a beautiful way to lie, but a terrible way to practice medicine. The concept of internal harmony in traditional Chinese philosophy further compounded the problem. Illness was often seen as an internal imbalance, and to admit to a chronic, persistent ailment could be interpreted as a personal failing in maintaining one's own harmony, or even a sign of spiritual weakness. For those at the apex of society, like the concubines and the emperor, this personal responsibility for health added another layer of pressure to conceal any illness that seemed to defy easy explanation or cure. Consider the desperate measures taken by individuals to conceal their symptoms. A concubine might avoid public appearances during flare-ups, attributing her absence to a mild cold or fatigue. She might spend exorbitant sums on unproven herbal remedies from outside the palace, risking charlatanism, rather than openly consulting imperial physicians who might uncover her secret. This individual battle, fought in isolation and silence, was a common tragedy within the palace walls. The pervasive fear of losing imperial favour meant that even if a concubine suspected the emperor was the source of her illness, she would never dare voice such an accusation. To do so would be an act of unimaginable treason, jeopardising her life and the lives of her entire family. So, the transmission continued, unchallenged, often from the emperor to his various consorts, and sometimes perhaps between consorts through less direct means, but always shrouded in a deep, impenetrable silence. The very structure of the court, with its distinct living quarters and strict protocols, ironically facilitated this secrecy. The concubines lived in separate palaces, their interactions often limited and formal. This made it easier for individual cases to remain isolated and for their specific illnesses to go unnoticed by the broader palace population, let alone the outside world. The palace, in effect, became a series of sealed chambers, each containing its own, quietly unfolding medical drama. You realise that the culture of the Forbidden City, while embodying the height of imperial power and refinement, also created an environment deeply hostile to transparency and effective public health. The immense social stigma attached to venereal diseases, combined with the paramount need for royal secrecy, locked the imperial court into a tragic cycle. Individuals suffered in silence, illnesses spread unchecked, and accurate knowledge of their prevalence remained elusive, buried beneath layers of euphemism and deliberate omission. This constant battle against truth, rather than disease, ensured that the blood of our title was indeed quietly flowing, staining the very legacy it was meant to sustain. This leads us to consider the often overlooked yet crucial role of another, equally silent group within the palace, the eunuchs, and their surprising connection to the chain of transmission. You now shift your gaze to a group often overlooked in the grand narratives of the Qing court, yet who held an intimate and complex position within the palace walls, the eunuchs. These castrated men, stripped of their reproductive capacity, were paradoxically central to the daily lives of the imperial family. You're about to uncover their unseen role as potential, albeit often unwitting, carriers in the spread of disease within the Forbidden City. Imagine the sheer number of eunuchs, thousands of them, serving every conceivable function within the palace, from managing finances and imperial decrees to attending to the most intimate personal needs of the emperor, empress, and concubines. They were the invisible backbone of the court, moving seamlessly between the male and female quarters, overseeing baths, dressing, meals, and even carrying messages that pertain to personal health. This constant, intimate proximity, combined with the lack of germ theory, made them a crucial, if unrecognized, link in the chain of infection. Mainstream historical fact confirms that eunuchs served as the primary male intermediaries within the inner court. Their unique status, neither fully male nor female in the traditional sense, allowed them unrestricted access to the imperial harem. While their castration meant they could not sexually transmit diseases, their hands, their clothing, and the implements they handled could certainly become vectors for bacterial transfer. Consider a eunuch assisting a concubine with her elaborate bathing ritual, perhaps touching a lesion or an area of discharge, and then, later, handling the emperor's bathing implements or attending to another concubine. Without understanding the microscopic world, hygiene practices, even if they were meticulous by the standards of the day, would not have been sufficient to prevent such transmission. Historians still argue about the precise extent of non-sexual transmission routes for venereal diseases within the imperial court, and the role of eunuchs in this. While direct sexual contact was undoubtedly the primary mode, the possibility of indirect transmission through fomites, inanimate objects that carry infectious agents, cannot be entirely dismissed. It's like trying to figure out if your current cold came from someone sneezing directly on you, or if it was that doorknob you touched after someone sneezed into their hand. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the eunuch's unique position as confidants. Given their lack of sexual threat, concubines might have felt more comfortable discussing sensitive ailments or intimate discomforts with a trusted eunuch than with a male physician or even another concubine. This role as a sympathetic listener could mean they were privy to information about infections, but without the medical knowledge or authority to truly intervene effectively. They heard the whispers, saw the hidden pains, but were powerless to break the cycle of transmission beyond their own limited sphere of influence. Their daily duties often involved handling items that came into direct contact with the imperial family's bodies. Think of the personal linens, bathing sponges, chamber pots, and even certain cosmetic tools. If any of these items came into contact with an infected body fluid or lesion, and were then handled by a eunuch who subsequently attended to another person without proper sterilization, a concept unheard of at the time, the potential for cross-contamination was real. This was not through malice, but through profound ignorance of how disease truly spread. You can imagine a eunuch diligently serving his mistress, carefully applying an ointment to a discreet rash on her skin, perhaps a secondary syphilitic lesion. Later he might assist the emperor with his personal hygiene, or prepare his tea or handle his clothing. While direct transmission of a fragile bacterium like Neisseria gonorrhoeae through such means might be low, other more robust pathogens could certainly survive briefly on surfaces. The constant intimate contact day in and day out multiplied these low probability events into a persistent background risk. The sheer logistics of the palace also played a role. With thousands of people, maintaining perfectly clean living conditions, even for the imperial family, was a continuous challenge. Water sources, waste disposal and general sanitation were rudimentary compared to modern standards. While the imperial quarters would have been the cleanest, the vast network of servants and eunuchs who maintained them still moved between different levels of cleanliness and potential contamination. The eunuchs themselves, though castrated, were still human beings susceptible to illness. They too could contract infections, not necessarily venereal ones, but other diseases that could weaken their immune systems or make them carriers of other pathogens. Their unique physical state and the procedures they underwent also posed their own set of health risks. This general environment of pre-antibiotic, pre-germ theory existence meant that disease was a constant companion for everyone, not just the imperial elite. The eunuch system, while a cornerstone of imperial administration and security, inadvertently created a unique pathway for disease transmission within the Forbidden City. Their unparalleled access to all areas of the palace, their intimate duties, and their position as trusted confidants meant they were woven into the very fabric of imperial life, including its hidden health crises. Their unseen role as potential carriers added another layer of complexity to the already challenging task of containing venereal diseases within the secluded court. Historians still argue about the extent to which the specific customs and practices within the Qing palace, including the role of eunuchs, facilitated disease transmission. Was it simply a reflection of the limitations of the era's medical knowledge, or did the unique social dynamics of the Forbidden City create conditions particularly ripe for silent spread? It's a complex interplay of biology, culture, and power. You begin to appreciate the layers of subtle danger that permeated the seemingly serene palace. The very individuals meant to serve and protect the imperial family, in their devotion and ignorance, could inadvertently contribute to its silent undoing. The eunuchs, though physically altered, were integral to the daily lives of the empresses, concubines, and the emperor, placing them in an unenviable position where their very closeness made them potential conduits of misfortune. This understanding of internal vulnerabilities now leads us to consider the external world and the slow, often reluctant introduction of radically new medical ideas into this insular imperial environment. You now step to the periphery of the Forbidden City, looking outward, as the Qing dynasty, for all its insularity, found itself increasingly confronted by foreign influences. This brings us to the Western medicine's slow infiltration into a deeply traditional and often resistant imperial court, a clash of paradigms that offered both potential salvation and profound cultural friction. Imagine the bustling port cities like Guangzhou, where foreign ships, laden with exotic goods, also brought unfamiliar ideas and, crucially, a radically different approach to medicine. While China possessed a sophisticated and ancient medical system, the West was on the cusp of revolutionary discoveries, germ theory, antiseptic practices, and eventually the development of targeted pharmaceutical drugs. These concepts, however, were utterly alien to the Qing court, whose worldview was rooted in centuries of tradition and self-sufficiency. Mainstream historical fact indicates that Western medicine began to make tentative inroads into China, primarily through Christian missionaries and later through diplomatic and trade channels, particularly during the late 18th and 19th centuries. Initially, their medical practices were met with suspicion and disdain. Traditional Chinese physicians viewed Western anatomical dissection as barbaric, and their reliance on chemical compounds rather than natural herbs as crude. The concept of microscopic organisms causing disease was simply unimaginable in a system that emphasized qi, yin, and yang. It was like showing an expert calligrapher a ballpoint pen and expecting them to be impressed. However, certain visible successes of Western medicine could not be entirely ignored. The most compelling, perhaps, was the smallpox vaccination. While China had its own method of variolation, inhaling dried smallpox scabs, the Western vaccination technique, using cowpox, proved demonstrably safer and more effective. This stark contrast in outcomes forced some imperial officials to at least consider the new approach, albeit cautiously. You can almost hear the grudging admiration, laced with deep skepticism, from a court that prided itself on its own intellectual superiority. For venereal diseases like gonorrhea and syphilis, Western medicine would eventually offer truly revolutionary treatments, though these came much later in the Qing period. Early Western treatments for syphilis, like mercury, were just as brutal and dangerous as their Chinese counterparts. However, the conceptual shift was profound. Western doctors, even without fully understanding bacteria initially, began to classify diseases based on specific symptoms and, crucially, sought to identify a singular causative agent. This contrasted sharply with the TCM approach of treating an imbalance within the whole body. Historians still argue whether the Qing court's resistance to adopting Western medicine more broadly was primarily due to cultural arrogance, genuine belief in the superiority of their own system, or a pragmatic fear of foreign influence undermining imperial authority. It was likely a complex blend of all three, creating a formidable institutional barrier against innovation. It's like trying to convince a 1,000-year-old oak tree to suddenly start growing oranges. A quirky or fringe tidbit is the anecdotal accounts of imperial officials or members of the gentry secretly consulting Western missionaries for specific ailments they couldn't get relief for from traditional Chinese doctors. These clandestine visits highlight the desperation that sometimes overcame cultural pride when faced with intractable suffering. Imagine a high-ranking courtier, under the cloak of night, sneaking out of the palace or sending a trusted servant to consult a foreign barbarian doctor, all while publicly espousing the virtues of Chinese medicine. The personal need for healing sometimes trumped political and cultural dogma. The initial acceptance of Western medicine within the court was often limited to specific visible interventions. For instance, Western surgical techniques, while primitive by today's standards, were sometimes employed for external tumours or injuries that traditional methods struggled with. However, internal diseases, especially those as sensitive and stigmatized as venereal infections, remained firmly within the domain of traditional Chinese medicine and its accompanying veil of secrecy. To admit a need for foreign remedies for such ailments would be to admit a profound failure, not just of imperial physicians, but potentially of the imperial family's own purity. The language barrier was also a significant hurdle. Medical texts and dialogues were deeply entrenched in their respective cultural and philosophical frameworks. Translating complex medical concepts, diagnostic methods, and pharmacological principles between Chinese and Western traditions was a monumental task, often leading to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. It's like trying to explain the rules of cricket using only terms from baseball. Even when Western doctors managed to gain some access, their diagnostic tools were still rudimentary. The discovery of the spirochete causing syphilis by Schaudin and Hoffmann, and the bacterium causing gonorrhea by Neisser, came in the late 19th century, well after much of the Qing dynasty's period of interest. So, while their conceptual framework was different, early Western doctors were still fighting these diseases largely without the ultimate weapons of modern microbiology and pharmacology. The real game changers, Salvarsan, penicillin, etc., wouldn't arrive until the 20th century. The imperial physicians, deeply learned in their own system, would have viewed Western medicine as fundamentally flawed, lacking the holistic understanding of the body and its connection to the cosmos. They might have dismissed Western treatments for venereal diseases as superficial, failing to address the underlying disharmony. This intellectual chasm, combined with cultural insularity, created a formidable barrier to the widespread adoption of Western medical practices within the inner sanctums of the Forbidden City. You witness a slow, almost imperceptible shift, as the empire, for all its steadfast traditions, begins to feel the inexorable pull of a rapidly modernizing world. The introduction of Western medicine, however piecemeal and resisted, represented the first crack in the intellectual and medical self-sufficiency of the Qing court. It was a sign that the solutions to their persistent internal health crises might lie beyond their ancient walls and ancestral knowledge. This growing awareness of external solutions, however grudgingly acknowledged, hints at the immense, often unacknowledged toll that the internal structures of the court, particularly the imperial harem, took on the health of its inhabitants. You now turn your attention to the very heart of the imperial domestic sphere, a place of immense beauty and cutthroat competition, the imperial harem. Within its gilded confines, a unique social dynamic emerged, transforming it into a veritable disease crucible, a perfect environment for the proliferation of venereal infections, silently undermining the lives of its inhabitants and the very continuity of the Qing lineage. Imagine the sheer number of women. Beyond the empress, the legitimate wife, there were hundreds, sometimes thousands of concubines, ranging from high-ranking consorts with their own palaces and retinues to lower-ranked ladies in waiting, all vying for the emperor's fleeting attention. This vast pool of women, chosen for their youth, beauty, and often their family's political influence, represented the apex of female ambition within the empire. Yet, their lives were defined by a single, central figure, the emperor. Mainstream historical fact confirms that the emperor's sexual activity within the harem was meticulously managed. Protocols dictated which concubines would be presented to him, often based on a rotating schedule or imperial whim. This system, designed to ensure a wide selection of potential mothers for heirs, paradoxically amplified the risk of disease transmission. The emperor, being the sole sexual partner for this multitude of women, became the central node in a vast network of potential infection. An infection originating with him could rapidly spread to dozens of women in a short period, and an infection introduced by one concubine could, if transmitted to the emperor, then be passed on to others. It's like a very exclusive, very dangerous and very gilded game of pass the parcel, where the prize is sometimes a painful illness. Consider the life of a concubine. Her entire existence revolved around the hope of catching the emperor's eye, securing a night with him, and most importantly bearing a son. This intense competition meant that any perceived flaw, any sign of illness, could be catastrophic to her prospects. Therefore, symptoms of venereal disease, such as unusual discharge, painful urination, or skin lesions, would be hidden at all costs. The culture of secrecy, already discussed, was particularly acute in the harem, where women were constantly scrutinized and eager to find fault in rivals. Historians still argue whether the high rates of infertility among imperial concubines, often documented with vague terms like cold womb or key deficiency, were primarily due to the widespread prevalence of untreated venereal diseases, particularly gonorrhea leading to pelvic inflammatory disease, PID, while other factors like diet, stress, and general gynecological issues certainly played a role. The correlation between a large multi-partner sexual network and such reproductive health problems is compelling. It's a complex medical mystery, shrouded by centuries of euphemism and a lack of modern diagnostic tools. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the belief, prevalent in some traditional medical thought, that certain herbal concoctions or dietary restrictions could enhance fertility or ward off unclean influences without any actual understanding of bacteria. Concubines, desperate to conceive, might consume these concoctions or adhere to strict, often unpleasant dietary regimes, all while their bodies were silently battling an underlying infection. It's a poignant image of hope and ignorance intertwined, a testament to the human desire for control in the face of the unknown. The psychological environment of the harem was also a powerful factor. The constant anxiety of competition, the loneliness of confinement, and the unpredictable nature of imperial favour would have created immense stress. This chronic stress could depress the immune system, making individuals more susceptible to infections and exacerbating existing conditions. A concubine suffering from chronic pain and discomfort due to untreated gonorrhea, while simultaneously navigating the treacherous social landscape of the harem, would have faced an unimaginable burden. The physical proximity of concubines, despite their separate quarters, also facilitated indirect transmission. While not sharing sexual partners, other than the emperor, they shared servants, bathing facilities, and communal areas. Shared bathing water, if not frequently changed, or communal toiletries could theoretically become indirect vectors for certain pathogens, especially in an era without modern sanitation and disinfection. While direct sexual contact was the predominant mode, these less obvious routes could contribute to a background level of transmission. The eunuchs, as explored in the previous section, were critical figures in this dynamic. Their constant movement between the emperor and the concubines, their intimate duties, and their handling of personal effects meant they were perfectly positioned to inadvertently transfer microorganisms. They were the silent, unwitting bridge over which diseases could traverse the otherwise segregated worlds within the palace. The very structure that enabled the emperor to maintain a vast lineage paradoxically became a breeding ground for diseases that threatened that lineage. Each new concubine introduced into the harem brought with her a unique health history, and though subject to initial examinations, the insidious nature of venereal diseases meant that latent infections could easily go undetected. The system, designed for reproductive robustness, was inherently fragile in the face of invisible pathogens. You realise that the imperial harem was not just a collection of beautiful women, it was a microcosm of vulnerability. The constant flow of potential mothers, the central role of the emperor as the sole male sexual partner, the intense competition, and the pervasive culture of secrecy combined to create an environment where venereal diseases could thrive, becoming endemic within this most secluded of populations. The beauty and allure of the harem masked a deeper hidden tragedy, a silent testament to the body's fragility even amidst immense power and luxury. This hidden health crisis within the harem, coupled with other societal changes, brings us to an even broader, more unsettling observation: the emerging role of opium and its pervasive impact on public health, further eroding the already fragile health of the dynasty. The threads of private suffering and public vice are beginning to weave a darker tapestry. You now feel the heavy, cloying scent of opium seeping into the atmosphere of the Qing dynasty, a new and devastating element intertwining with the existing health crises. Its growing prevalence, initially among the populace, and later touching even the fringes of the imperial court, played a synergistic role in the decline of health, profoundly weakening individuals and making them more susceptible to the very diseases we've been discussing. Imagine the smoky dens, initially in the bustling port cities and then spreading inland, where individuals sought solace or escape in the hypnotic embrace of the opium pipe. This wasn't just a recreational drug, it became a pervasive social ill, a drain on individual vitality and national resources. While its direct connection to venereal disease might not be immediately obvious, its indirect effects on public health, immunity and social stability created a far more vulnerable populace. Mainstream historical fact unequivocally links the rampant spread of opium addiction in 19th century China to British trade policies and the Opium Wars. This widespread addiction had devastating consequences for Chinese society, including economic ruin, social decay, and, crucially for our narrative, a severe impact on public health. Opium addicts, often malnourished and living in squalor, suffered from weakened immune systems, making them far more susceptible to opportunistic infections. While the imperial court itself likely did not openly engage in opium consumption, its prevalence in the broader society and among court servants or eunuchs who might have secretly indulged could have created a general environment of lowered resistance. Consider an individual already battling a chronic, untreated venereal infection like gonorrhea. The constant pain and discomfort might lead them to seek relief in opium. The drug, while providing temporary escape, would further depress their appetite, lead to malnutrition, and compromise their already weakened immune system. This makes them more vulnerable not just to the progression of their existing venereal disease, but also to secondary infections, tuberculosis or other common ailments. It's like throwing gasoline on a smouldering fire. The problem you already have suddenly becomes much, much worse. Historians still argue about the precise extent to which opium addiction contributed directly to mortality rates from venereal diseases. While it was rarely the sole cause of death, it undoubtedly acted as a powerful cofactor, accelerating the decline of health and making individuals more vulnerable to the severe long-term consequences of untreated STIs. It's a grim symbiotic relationship where one scourge feeds another. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit from the period describes some quack doctors or charlatans who would mix opium with various traditional remedies, claiming it would cure a multitude of ailments, including sores of the nether regions. While these concoctions might have provided temporary pain relief due to the opium, they did nothing to address the underlying bacterial infection and often led to further addiction and health deterioration. Imagine the desperation of someone suffering from chronic pain, falling prey to such false promises, unknowingly trading one misery for another. The social and economic impact of opium addiction also indirectly affected health within the court's periphery. As families were ruined by addiction, their ability to provide healthy, well-nourished individuals for imperial service diminished. The general decline in public health standards outside the palace walls meant that the pool from which concubines, eunuchs and servants were drawn was potentially less robust, increasing the chances of introducing existing latent illnesses into the imperial environment. You might envision the gradual moral decay that accompanied the rise of opium. While the Qing court preached Confucian ideals of self-discipline and virtue, the widespread addiction created a profound dissonance. This societal weakening, a drain on national spirit and physical well-being, naturally filtered upwards. Even if the emperor himself never touched opium, his ministers, his soldiers, and the very populace he ruled were being silently consumed, reducing the overall vitality of the empire. The synergistic effect is crucial to understand. It wasn't just that people were addicted to opium and had venereal diseases. It was that opium addiction made them significantly more susceptible to the worst outcomes of venereal diseases. Malnutrition due to addiction meant the body lacked the resources to fight off infection. Lack of personal hygiene, often associated with addiction, could exacerbate skin lesions or open sores, making them prone to secondary bacterial infections. The general apathy and lethargy induced by opium also meant that individuals were less likely to seek timely medical attention for their venereal symptoms, allowing the diseases to progress to more dangerous stages. Furthermore, the economic drain of purchasing opium diverted resources that could have been used for food, clean water, or legitimate medical care. For a family struggling with an addict, basic necessities often took a backseat to the drug. This widespread impoverishment and neglect created a cycle of ill health that permeated society, a stark contrast to the perceived grandeur of the imperial court. The Qing government's futile attempts to ban opium, culminating in the Opium Wars, highlight the scale of the crisis. These wars, fought over the right to import this destructive drug, further destabilized the empire, leading to internal rebellions and increased foreign encroachment. This external turmoil meant that resources and attention that could have been directed towards public health initiatives, including addressing venereal diseases, were instead diverted to military conflicts and suppressing internal unrest. The health of the nation, and by extension the court, suffered as a result. You observe how the once mighty Qing dynasty, already grappling with internal contradictions and the silent spread of disease, was now facing a profound external threat in the form of opium. This drug, far from being a simple vice, became a powerful accelerant to the empire's health decline, deepening the well of suffering and making individuals, and by extension the dynastic core, more vulnerable to all forms of illness, including the insidious venereal diseases that plagued the court. The stage is now set to explore how these multifaceted internal and external pressures converged, contributing to the broader narrative of the dynasty's decline, subtly intertwined with the hidden illnesses of its rulers. You now trace the converging lines of individual suffering and national malaise, recognizing how the hidden illnesses within the royal court subtly mirrored and contributed to the broader narrative of dynastic decline that characterized the later years of the Qing dynasty. The silent, insidious spread of venereal diseases, coupled with other internal weaknesses and external pressures, acted as a slow poison, eroding the vitality and legitimacy of an empire struggling to maintain its ancient grandeur. Imagine the Qing dynasty in its twilight years, a once mighty dragon now seemingly weary, beset by rebellions, foreign encroachments, and a growing sense of internal decay. While historians point to a multitude of factors for its eventual fall, corruption, ineffective governance, natural disasters, and the relentless pressure of Western powers, the health of its rulers and the integrity of its lineage were undeniably intertwined with its strength. A sickly emperor, a scarcity of healthy heirs, or a court quietly debilitated by chronic stigmatized illnesses would subtly undermine the very foundation of the imperial authority. Mainstream historical fact emphasizes the increasingly frail health of several later Qing emperors, from the Tongji Emperor to the Guangxu Emperor, whose reigns were often marked by periods of unexplained illness, mental instability, or early demise. While official records rarely explicitly state venereal diseases as the cause, The symptoms described in various accounts, combined with the prevalent practices of the harem, are highly suggestive. A ruler suffering from chronic pain, debilitating fatigue, or the cognitive impairments associated with advanced syphilis would be less effective in governing a vast and complex empire, particularly during a period of intense internal and external challenges. It's like trying to steer a massive ship through a storm with a captain who's constantly seasick and half-blind. Consider the ripple effect of such imperial ill health. An emperor too unwell to attend to state affairs, or too mentally compromised to make sound judgments, would leave a power vacuum. This vacuum would inevitably be filled by powerful factions, ambitious eunuchs, assertive empress dowagers, like Cixi, who wielded immense power during the reigns of her son and nephew, or influential grand councillors. While this might ensure the daily functioning of government, it ultimately eroded the emperor's supreme authority, creating instability and fostering an environment of intrigue and infighting. The silent illnesses of the imperial body politic thus translated into tangible political weakness. Historians still argue about the direct causal link between the physical health of Qing emperors and the broader decline of the dynasty. While it's an oversimplification to say that venereal disease alone brought down the empire, it undoubtedly weakened the institution of the emperorship, contributed to succession anxieties, and diminished the perceived vitality of the ruling house. Was the declining health a symptom or a cause of deeper malaise? It's a bit of a chicken and egg question, but the two were inextricably linked. A grim dance of biological and political decay. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the concept of qi deficiency, or essence depletion, being broadly applied to explain various forms of imperial decline, both personal and dynastic. While rooted in traditional Chinese medicine, this concept could serve as a convenient face-saving explanation for a range of symptoms, including those caused by venereal diseases without delving into specifics. Furthermore, the idea of an emperor's essence being depleted through excessive sexual activity, even if for the purpose of producing heirs, was a cultural concern. This concern, combined with the presence of STIs, would have created a potent narrative of decline, even if the biological mechanisms were misunderstood. It's like watching a grand fireworks display slowly fizzle out, and attributing it to the universe losing its sparkle, rather than just damp powder. The impact on the imperial lineage was perhaps the most profound manifestation of this decline. The difficulty in producing robust male heirs, whether due to infertility caused by gonorrhea or congenital syphilis in offspring, created immense pressure on the succession. A scarcity of healthy princes or the early deaths of those who were born led to smaller, less vigorous pools of potential successors. This vulnerability at the very top made the dynasty appear less blessed by heaven, eroding public confidence and providing fodder for rebellious movements. A strong lineage symbolized a strong mandate. A failing lineage suggested its withdrawal. You might envision the desperate prayers offered in ancestral temples for the birth of a healthy prince, prayers that went unanswered, or were answered with tragedy. The personal anguish of an emperor whose concubines bore him no living sons or only sickly ones would have been immense, and this private pain had public consequences. It highlighted the dynasty's vulnerability, contrasting sharply with the long, fertile reigns of earlier, more robust emperors. The secrecy surrounding these illnesses also contributed to the dynastic decline by preventing rational public health responses. If the highest echelons of society were silently suffering, and this suffering was never openly acknowledged or systematically addressed, how could broader public health issues be tackled? The inability to confront internal weaknesses, especially those tied to shameful diseases, signalled a broader institutional weakness, a resistance to adapting to new realities. The broader societal impact of widespread illness, including the effects of opium addiction, further weakened the empire from the ground up. A population ravaged by disease, addiction, and poverty is less productive, less able to resist external threats, and more prone to discontent. While not directly caused by venereal disease in the court, this general societal ill health created a context of decline into which the imperial family's own vulnerabilities seamlessly fit. The dynastic decline, therefore, was not a singular event, but a complex interplay of forces, both grand and microscopic. The silent, hidden suffering within the Forbidden City, the persistent illnesses of its rulers and consorts, played a subtle but significant role. They eroded confidence, created instability and succession, and diminished the perceived strength of the imperial institution at a time when the empire needed it most. It's a powerful testament to how even the most intimate aspects of life, health and reproduction, can have profound, far-reaching consequences for the fate of nations. This realization brings us to the crucial challenge of understanding this hidden history, the fragmentary and often deliberately obscured nature of historical records themselves. You now face the daunting challenge of illuminating the hidden narrative of disease in the Qing court, a task made immensely difficult by the nature of historical records, gaps and clues. Imagine attempting to piece together a complex mosaic when many of the tiles are missing. Some are deliberately obscured, and others are simply too faded to reveal their original colours. This is the reality for historians seeking to understand the true extent of venereal diseases within the Forbidden City. The fundamental problem lies in the pervasive culture of secrecy and face-saving that defined the imperial court. Mainstream historical fact confirms that official records regarding imperial health were meticulously maintained, but they were also highly censored and euphemistic, particularly concerning sensitive or stigmatizing conditions. An emperor's illness might be described as a malaise, a deficiency of qi, or an imbalance of humours. A concubine's infertility could be attributed to a cold womb or difficulty in nurturing essence. Explicit mention of venereal diseases like gonorrhea or syphilis was almost unheard of in public or even private imperial archives. It was a deliberate act of historical obfuscation designed to protect the face and legitimacy of the imperial family. It's like trying to get a straight answer from a politician about their weekend plans. You know there's something they're not telling you. This means that historians must act like medical detectives, sifting through oblique references, analysing patterns of illness, and cross-referencing seemingly unrelated details. For instance, repeated instances of miscarriages, stillbirths, or the early deaths of imperial infants, especially those with unspecific symptoms, could be clues pointing towards congenital syphilis. Similarly, chronic joint pain, persistent fevers, or unexplained skin lesions in emperors or high-ranking concubines, if described vaguely over long periods, might suggest the progression of untreated venereal infections. Historians still argue about the precise interpretation of these euphemistic medical records. Some scholars remain cautious, emphasizing the lack of definitive diagnostic terms, while others employ modern medical knowledge to infer likely diagnoses from the described symptoms. The debate highlights the inherent difficulties in retrospectively diagnosing illnesses across vast cultural and temporal divides. It's a bit like trying to translate a highly technical manual written in a dead language, where some key terms have completely different meanings now. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is the examination of incidental records, such as private diaries of eunuchs or low-ranking officials, or even the ledgers detailing the purchase of specific herbs or remedies. While not direct medical diagnoses, these fragments can sometimes offer tantalizing, albeit indirect, clues. For example, a sudden increase in the purchase of mercury-based compounds, or herbs traditionally used for sores of the lower body, could suggest a localized outbreak of venereal disease, even if the official records remain silent. These are the equivalent of finding a cryptic note in a bottle, offering a glimpse into a hidden truth. The deliberate destruction or suppression of records also contributed to these gaps. After an emperor's death, or a major political upheaval, sensitive documents might have been purged to protect the reputation of the deceased, or to rewrite history in a favourable light. This practice, common in many dynastic transitions, further complicates the historian's task, removing potentially crucial evidence that could shed light on royal health. Moreover, the sheer volume of imperial records itself, while impressive, can be overwhelming. Sifting through millions of characters, meticulously transcribed, to find a few oblique references to illness requires immense dedication and linguistic skill. The context is everything. A single word or phrase, seemingly innocuous, might hold a deeper meaning when understood within the specific medical and cultural lexicon of the Qing court. You also consider the limitations of autopsy and modern forensic analysis. While some imperial tombs have been excavated, the preservation of remains and the willingness to subject them to invasive modern scientific examination remain complex and sensitive issues. DNA analysis, for example, could potentially confirm the presence of bacterial pathogens in skeletal remains, offering definitive answers where textual records only provide hints. However, such studies are rare and highly controversial, respecting cultural sensitivities surrounding imperial burials. The challenge, therefore, is not merely finding documents, but interpreting them through multiple lenses: historical context, cultural norms, traditional medical theory, and modern scientific understanding. The gaps in the records are not just empty spaces, they're often deliberate silences, filled with unspoken anxieties and hidden truths. The clues, conversely, are often subtle hints, whispered between the lines, requiring a discerning eye and a willingness to look beyond the official narrative. The historian's role here is akin to an archaeologist meticulously excavating a site, knowing that the most valuable artifacts might be buried deepest or carefully camouflaged within the mundane. Each fragmented medical report, each vague reference to an imperial ailment, becomes a potential piece of the larger puzzle, shedding light on the silent suffering that permeated the most powerful household in the empire. This ongoing scholarly debate, fueled by both the scarcity and the ambiguity of evidence, underscores the persistent mystery surrounding the true health landscape of the Qing court. It's a testament to the power of hidden narratives and the enduring difficulty of extracting truth from a past carefully curated by those in power. Yet, this very challenge makes the pursuit all the more compelling, inviting modern insights to shed new light on these ancient plagues. You now bridge the vast expanse of time, bringing modern insights to bear on the ancient plagues that haunted the Qing dynasty's royal court. Imagine the stark contrast: the imperial physician, meticulously feeling a pulse and consulting ancient scrolls, versus a modern epidemiologist, analysing DNA sequences and microscopic images. This leap in understanding allows us to infer the likely impact of these historical outbreaks with far greater clarity, even in the face of fragmented records. Mainstream historical fact, armed with the knowledge of germ theory and the specific characteristics of Neisseria gonorrhoeae and Treponema pallidum, the bacterium causing syphilis, can now reconstruct the probable course and impact of these diseases in the Qing court. We understand that gonorrhea, if untreated, commonly leads to pelvic inflammatory disease, PID, in women, resulting in chronic pain, ectopic pregnancies, and irreversible infertility. We know that syphilis progresses through stages, with a highly infectious primary stage, chancre, a secondary stage, rashes, fever, hair loss, a latent stage, asymptomatic but still infectious, and finally, a tertiary stage that can cause devastating damage to the brain, heart, bones, and other organs. This scientific understanding illuminates the suffering that was once shrouded in mystery and euphemism. Consider the implications for the imperial harem. Modern insights into gonorrhea's effects on female fertility strongly suggest that a significant portion of the unexplained infertility among concubines could indeed be attributed to untreated gonococcal infections. Imagine the crushing disappointment of a young woman, perfectly healthy by outward appearances, who simply could not conceive, her fallopian tubes silently scarred by an infection decades before penicillin could offer a cure. This explains the desperate reliance on fertility tonics and the endless succession of concubines, always hoping for the lucky one who might conceive, despite the rampant underlying health issues. Historians still argue about the relative contribution of venereal diseases versus other factors, like diet, general health, or simply bad luck, to the high rates of infant mortality and reproductive difficulties in the imperial lineage. However, modern medical understanding provides a powerful lens, allowing us to reevaluate vague historical accounts of frail children, weak constitutions, or failed pregnancies as potentially tragic outcomes of congenital syphilis. It's like discovering the true culprit in an old cold case, simply by having better forensic tools available now. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is how modern genomic studies of ancient bacterial strains, recovered from skeletal remains, though not yet from Qing imperial individuals directly, due to preservation and access issues, are starting to shed light on the evolution and historical spread of these pathogens. While speculative for the Qing, imagine a future where DNA analysis of an imperial bone could definitively confirm the presence of Treponema pallidum, solving centuries-old medical mysteries. It's like sending a biological time machine back to collect direct evidence. The neurological and psychological symptoms described for some later Qing emperors, periods of lethargy, irrational behaviour, or sudden mental decline, become far more comprehensible when viewed through the lens of tertiary syphilis, neurosyphilis. While other causes are certainly possible, the patterns align disturbingly well with the known effects of the disease on the brain. This doesn't definitively prove a diagnosis, but it certainly offers a powerful and medically plausible explanation for historical enigmas. Modern epidemiology also teaches us about the dynamics of disease transmission within closed populations. The Forbidden City, as a self-contained ecosystem with a central, highly active male sexual partner, fits the model for rapid and persistent spread of sexually transmitted infections. The lack of effective diagnostic tools, combined with the cultural imperative for secrecy, created an ideal environment for these pathogens to become endemic, silently circulating through the imperial family for generations. It was a perfect storm of social custom, medical ignorance, and biological reality. The understanding of co-infections is also crucial. A person suffering from one venereal disease might be more susceptible to others, or to opportunistic infections due to a compromised immune system. For instance, the presence of syphilis lesions could make a person more vulnerable to contracting gonorrhea, and vice versa. This complex interplay of different pathogens likely compounded the suffering and made treatment even more challenging for ancient physicians. Furthermore, modern public health principles emphasize the importance of breaking chains of transmission through diagnosis, treatment, and contact tracing. The Qing court, with its pervasive secrecy and limited medical understanding, was utterly incapable of implementing such measures. This highlights why these diseases persisted for so long within the imperial family. Despite the best efforts of individual physicians, the system itself was ill-equipped to handle an epidemic of this nature. You now appreciate that the suffering of the Qing emperors and their concubines was not just a historical footnote, but a profound human tragedy, understandable through the precise mechanisms of modern medicine. The blood in our title takes on new meaning, referring not just to lineage, but to the microbial battle silently waged within the imperial body. The beauty of the court, the power of the emperor, the intricate rituals, all were underpinned by a fragile biological reality, constantly threatened by unseen enemies. This modern perspective doesn't just explain the past, it also serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring importance of medical science and public health. It emphasizes how far humanity has come in understanding and combating diseases that once brought even the mightiest empires to their knees. The silent, insidious nature of these ancient plagues, once a source of baffling mystery, is now revealed with chilling clarity. This brings us to the final contemplation of their lasting impact, the echoes they left behind in the very corridors of power. You now stand in the empty, echoing corridors of the Forbidden City, the final scene of our journey into concubines, beauty and blood. The bustling court, the whispers of intrigue, the vibrant silks, all have faded, leaving behind only the echoes in palace corridors. This final reflection invites you to contemplate the lasting legacy of these hidden illnesses on the perception of the Qing dynasty and its rulers, a subtle yet indelible stain on their historical narrative. Imagine the palace today, grand, majestic, a symbol of a bygone era's power. Yet, as you walk its silent courtyards, you can almost sense the lingering presence of hidden suffering. The stories of concubines who faded into obscurity, emperors whose reigns were cut short by mysterious ailments, and children who never saw adulthood, all take on a new poignant meaning when viewed through the lens of undetected or untreated venereal diseases. The beauty of the court was often a mask, and the blood of its lineage was subtly poisoned. Mainstream historical fact, even today, often frames the decline of the Qing dynasty primarily through political, economic and social lenses, corruption, rebellions, and Western encroachment. However, our journey has revealed a crucial, often overlooked internal factor. The chronic illness within the imperial family, fueled by venereal diseases, undoubtedly contributed to a weakened leadership, succession anxieties, and a general erosion of imperial vitality. While it wasn't the sole cause of the dynasty's fall, it acted as a persistent underlying condition, making the empire more vulnerable to external pressures. It's like a grand old house that eventually collapses, not just because of the storms outside, but because its foundations were slowly rotting from within. Consider the historical perception of certain Qing emperors. For instance, the Tongji emperor, who died young and without an heir, and the Guangxu emperor, who suffered from chronic ill health and died suspiciously young, both faced periods of unusual weakness or mental instability. While their official biographies are careful to avoid scandalous details, the patterns of their decline, especially when viewed through modern medical understanding, lend themselves to reinterpretation. Could what was once attributed to overwork, melancholy, or constitutional weakness actually have been the devastating effects of tertiary syphilis, silently eroding their bodies and minds? Historians still argue whether definitive diagnoses can truly be made without biological evidence, but the questions linger, adding a layer of tragic vulnerability to these historical figures. A particularly quirky or fringe tidbit is how traditional Chinese ghost stories and folk tales, often born from real-life tragedies, might have subtly incorporated elements of these hidden diseases. A pale, wasting lady of the court, a phantom cough in the night, or a child born with strange markings. These unexplained phenomena, stripped of their medical understanding, could easily be transformed into supernatural tales, inadvertently echoing the silent suffering caused by venereal infections. It's like hearing a muffled scream through a very thick wall and imagining a ghost when it was simply someone in agony. The enduring legacy of royal secrecy also shapes our understanding. The deliberate obfuscation of medical records means that the true scale of venereal disease within the Qing court will likely never be fully known. The gaps in the records are not accidental. They are a testament to the power of stigma and the relentless drive to protect imperial face. This silence, however, speaks volumes, suggesting a problem too pervasive and shameful to openly acknowledge. You might reflect on the human cost of this silence. The concubines, living lives of luxurious confinement, suffered in isolation, their beauty and fertility sacrificed to a system that unwittingly exposed them to debilitating illness. Their personal agonies, the heartbreaks of infertility and lost children, were not merely private tragedies. They were the unseen casualties of an empire striving for unbroken lineage while neglecting fundamental aspects of health. The contrast between the outward grandeur of the Forbidden City and the internal fragility of its inhabitants is striking. The elaborate rituals, the immense power, the dazzling displays of wealth, all were unable to shield the imperial family from microscopic invaders. This serves as a powerful reminder that even the most absolute power cannot command biological reality. The vulnerability of the human body, regardless of status, remains a universal constant. The echoes in these palace corridors are not just whispers of past lives. They are a reminder of the timeless struggle between humanity and disease. They speak of the slow, often hidden, ways that illness can erode strength, influence decision-making, and subtly alter the course of history. The story of gonorrhea and syphilis in the Qing court is a testament to the profound impact of medical knowledge, or its absence, social mores, and the inherent fragility of life itself. It is a sombre reflection, but one that offers a deeper, more nuanced understanding of a magnificent, yet ultimately vulnerable dynasty. The beauty was real, the blood flowed, and the diseases were a silent, unseen constant, leaving their indelible mark on the stone and silk echoing down through the centuries. The last traces of court intrigue fade with the moonlight, leaving only the gentle hum of your fan. The heavy scent of incense and forgotten secrets dissipates, replaced by the calming stillness of your room. The whispers of the Forbidden City now recede, becoming a soft, distant murmur, much like the gentle rhythm of your own breath. You are safe, nestled in your quiet space, far removed from the silent sufferings of imperial concubines and the anxieties of ancient emperors. The echoes have faded, and the past has settled back into its slumber. Let the remaining threads of their story unravel in the quiet comfort of your dreams.